So my topic today is just going to be about developing in Python in general and how to manage your dependencies, whether it is Python itself or third-party packages. All right. So what are the contents of this talk? We're going to be going through Pyenv, Poetry, and how they integrate with Django. All right. So what is Pyenv? Pyenv lets you easily switch between multiple versions of Python. It's very simple, it's very easy, and it follows the Unix tradition of having a single purpose and doing it very well. So why would you use something like Pyenv to manage Python instead of using some of the alternatives? So what are the alternatives? You have the system Python, which is 2.7, which is available on macOS, and I believe still available on certain versions of Linux. And you have other versions of Python you could install from the source, or a package manager like Chocolatey on Windows or Brew on Mac. All right. Some of the downsides of those alternatives is that you won't be able to easily switch between your Python versions. If you wanted to test something like, let's say, in Python 3.6 and then quickly go to Python 3.9, you won't be able to do that easily using a package manager. And it will pollute your public environment, which is not a very good thing. Um, if you're using Pyenv, you're going to be able to test your packages very easily using something like Tox, which has a very good integration with Pyenv, and you'll also be able to quickly test different flavors of Python. So you'll have something like PyPy, which is a static version of Python, or Jython, Java implementation of Python, and you could also specify your Python version per project. So let's say you've developed a script or an app or web app that depends on a certain version of Python. You can specify that Python version and pin it so that when you come back to that project, it still works as intended. All right. So how does Pyenv work? Pyenv works by different layers. It has the system Python, which again, we said could be 2.7, 3 point whatever, depending on which OS you have. And then you have the global version of Pyenv, which you set globally. And then you have the local version of Pyenv. And then you have a shell. So the local version is per project based Python version. The global version is everywhere. And then a Pyenv shell is something you use if you want to quickly test a Python version using the interactive shell. All right. And how are you going to be installing Pyenv? You have three different ways for the three different OSs. You can use something like Brew, Chocolatey, or on Linux, you can use their installer using curl. After you've done that, make sure you add the configuration to either your bash profile, your zish RC, or your bash on Linux. Make sure you add it using the command listed here in this PowerPoint, and make sure that init, that pyenv init, is literally at the end of your file, just so you can make sure those shims that pyenv uses works properly. All right, so moving on to poetry before we move on to our demo. So what is poetry? Poetry is a tool to manage your dependencies, your sub-dependencies, and it allows you to declare your libraries in a very nice way and manage them easily and update them. All right. So why would you use something like poetry as opposed to the other alternatives out there, such as pip, pipenv, or any other package manager for Python? Well, poetry auto-resolves your sub-dependencies and auto-deletes your sub-dependencies when your main dependency is deleted. What that basically means is when you install a package, that package has dependencies it depends on. So let's say you install pandas, it's going to depend on NumPy, and it's going to install NumPy as a sub-dependency. When you declare that dependency, pandas, you won't have a record of NumPy cluttering your metadata. You'll have it in your log file, but you won't have it cluttering your metadata, which we will see very shortly. And the nice thing about poetry, again, is that it manages those sub-dependencies very nicely for you. So when you go in and you uninstall pandas, it will uninstall NumPy for you, so it's not cluttering your virtual environment. The other very nice thing about poetry is that it will allow you to differentiate between development dependencies and main dependencies. So you have some of the dependencies that you need for your project to work on production. So those things could be hard dependencies like Django or requests. And then you have other dependencies which are more of a development dependency like tests such as PyTest, or linters like Flake8 or PyLint, or formatters like isort and black. All right. The other thing about poetry that's very nice is that it has a lock file, as I mentioned a bit. Uh, and that lock file specifies the exact versions of all your dependencies and sub-dependencies. So you won't face any issues where it works on a machine and it doesn't work on the other machine, because you will have the same exact versions. The other thing nice about poetry is that it will allow you to install scripts to automate some of your tasks, which we will look into, and it has very good integration with Pyenv. All right. So to install Poetry, you're gonna need to follow the instructions off of their official documentation. So you can use curl to download it on Mac OS or Linux, and then you can use invoke web request to install it on PowerShell. Let's move on to our demo. All right. So assuming that you've installed your Pyenv and Poetry, let's look at just some of the things we can do here. So if I do Pyenv, it seems like I have Pyenv installed. And if I do,
Mohammed,
yes.
we
Oh,
can
sorry.
only see your PowerPoint screen.
Sorry. Okay. Can you guys see my terminal now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So you can see that I have access to Pyenv right here, and this is assuming that you've installed it. All right. So what are the things that I can do with Pyenv? As I'd mentioned earlier, you can install different versions of Pyenv, or sorry, Python. So let's check those out. If I just did pyenv install -- list, so I can see here I have plenty of different versions I can choose from and install and see what I want for my particular use case. All right, let me just clear my screen right here, and let's see what versions I have installed. As you can see here, I have my system Python, which is 2.7, and then I have several other different Python versions. And I have 3.8.5, which has an asterisk next to it, which means this is my globally set Python version. So if I do Python right now, instead of doing Python 3 like you're used to on Mac OS or Linux to access the Python 3.0 and above version, you just need to do Python here. We can see here that my Python version is 3.8.5. If I do a which Python, you'll see that it is pointing to Pyenv's shims version, which is separate from the Python versions installed by Brew, or the Python version installed by the official source or the system Python. All right, so let's just go into my development directory. All right, and let me just go into Python so I can demo something. All right, let me just make a new directory and say pyenv example. All right, I'll cd into that directory, and again, my Python version is 3.8.5. Let's say I want to set it to a different version. Now I can go about it two different ways. Again, I can use any version I've pre-installed, or I can install a new version and use that version. Let me just show you an example of how to install a new version. So let's just do install, and let's say I want, let's just look at the list that we have here and install a different version that I don't have on my system right now. So let's just use 3.7.9. All right, so we'll do pyenv install. All right, and that should be installing a 3.7.9 version into my Pyenv versions. All right, and I'll be able to use it shortly. Now let's look at a different example here. Assuming we've installed the version that I want, and let's say I want to use Pyenv or Python version 3.7.4. So I'll do pyenv local, and I'll set my local version to 3.7.4. All right, so now if I do a python-v, you'll see that my Python version is 3.7.4. Now, if I want to change my global version to something else other than 3.8.5, so now let's just see if that has finished installing. It hasn't. Let's assume we want to change my global version to 3.9. I can do that. And if I do Pyenv versions again, you'll see that this is set by the Python version locally. And if I cd out of this directory and I run that command again, you'll see that the Python version outside of this directory is the global version, which is 3.9. Let's go back into this directory and see what's going on here. If I do a ls-la, you'll see that I have a file here, which is called .python version. And if I look into this file, you'll see that all it has is the Python version that I wanted to use for this directory. All right. So we're done with that. We'll just pop out of this directory and delete it. And let's see how Pyenv integrates with Poetry and how we'll use both of them at the same time. So to create a new project using Poetry, you're going to want to use the command called poetry new. Assuming that we have Poetry installed, if I do Poetry right here, you'll see the list of all the commands available to me. And if you want more details on them, obviously you can use each command here and then do a --help to see more details, or you could reference their official documentation. All right. So now I want to use the poetry new command, and I'll say poetry Django. That is what I want to call my poetry project. Now, if I cd into that directory and do a tree right here, we'll see that this is the project that it's created. It created a README file, a poetry Django file, folder with an init file in it, and a PyProject toml file. Now, if I look into my PyProject toml file, you'll see that it has some metadata that I was speaking of earlier, and you'll see that the Python version specified right here is 3.9. All right, and this is done by using Pyenv, all right, and it also has a dev dependency out of the box, which is PyTest. To change the version of Python, I could do Pyenv local, and let's say I wanted to do 3.8.5, and then I want to say poetry env use Python 3.8.5, right? Now, sorry, just give me a second here. Let me just test something out here. All right. So the issue here I'm facing is that inside my toml file, I have a version larger than the version I'm trying to specify with Pyenv. This is a common mistake you'll face. So let me just change that and give me a second here. All right. So let me just go into my toml file. And I'll change this to 3.8 just so I can lower my version of Python. So now if I do Python 3.8.5, or yep, that should work. All right. So now I'm using a Python 3.8 version instead of a Python 3.9, which is set globally. All right. So how would you go about creating your Django project right here? What would you do to create your Django project? If we look into our project directory, we'll see that there is a version number here, which is the same as the version right here. And this is something you might use to control your version and release your package. But with something like Django, you don't necessarily need it. So I could either remove this project directory, I could delete the init file, or I could just remove that version from that init file. I'll just opt for removing that init file entirely. And then I can do an install of Django. So I'll do poetry add Django. So instead of something like pip install Django, it's poetry add Django. All right, and that will go in and update all my dependencies and auto-resolve the sub-dependencies. As you can see, it's installing all those dependencies without me looking specifically into those dependencies in my TOML file. So if I go back into my TOML file, the only thing I will see is Django right here, right under Python. I'm not concerned with the other dependencies which are listed in my log file. To create a Django project, you would have to use the Django admin command. Now, if you were using something like pip, you would activate your environment, and then you would use Django admin to start your project and create all those files that you need for your Django project. With something like Poetry, you don't need to do that. All you have to do is Poetry run, and what Poetry run will do, it will launch a child process, activate that virtual environment for you, and run that command in that child process. So now I'll just do a start project, and we'll call it Poetry Django. And then I say I'll pass in that last argument, which means I want it to be created right here. All right. So now if I do another tree, you'll see that it created my init file, my ASCII, my settings, my URLs, etc., etc. Now, if I want to start my server again with something like pip, you would activate your environment and then you would start your server using manage.py. With something like Poetry, you can just do Poetry run Python. Again, since we're using Pyenv, we don't need to specify the version of Python because it knows what version we want to use in this project directory. So I'll do Poetry run Python manage.py, and then I'll do, let's say, run server. All right, and now my server is up and running, and I can go to localhost 8000, and my server should be up. A better way of doing this would be automating the manage py script. So you could use just the manage command without specifying that exact file. All right, so the way to go about doing that, we can specify something here called tool.poetry.scripts. And this is the scripts part where I was saying you could automate some of your stuff. And I want to call my command manage. So that's my command name. And what is my task that I want to automate? I want to automate the manage.py file. So if I take a look into that manage.py file, I see that I have a callable object that is called main. And this callable object could be anything. It could be a function, it could be a class, it could be anything that you would call in Python with parentheses. All right, so to reference this main file or this main command, I'll use dot notation to import that file and then reference that callable object after a colon. All right. So since this manage.py file is at the top level of my project directory, at my root directory, I don't have any other files to use a dot notation for. All I have to do is a colon, and I'll do a main right here. So what this basically is doing, it's essentially doing a from manage, all right, import main, all right. So if I had a package and I wanted to import a callable object within this module, within this package, I would do something like from my package dot module import main, and that would look something like here, something like this here. My package dot module, and then the colon here main. All right. Okay, so let's test this out and see how that works. First of all, as soon as you do that, you're going to need to run an install to make sure that script is installed. All right. And I can see here that it installed my current project, which means it installed all the scripts that I had listed. And if I do a poetry run manage, I should be seeing this working. All right. And it does work. The other thing you can do with Poetry to activate your environment, instead of sourcing the exact environment, all you have to do is a Poetry shell. All right. So what this does, again, it spawns a shell, a child process, and then it activates that environment for you. And now you're in your environment, like you would source into it. Now, the assumption here is that I would be able to use manage normally again, and let's try that out. And it seems to be working. That sums it up for the demonstration. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to ask me.
So Thnayan, for example, if we want to run migrations or make migrations, would it be just manage make migrations or manage migrations?
Let's try that out. I tried a manage make migrations and that worked. And I'll try a manage migrate, and that seems to be working as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. And if you guys have cloned your project from another team member, an easy way to install all your dependencies would be to do something like a poetry install. So obviously I have all my dependencies installed. And if you wanted to update a package, the way to go about it is to do, let's say I wanted to update my dev dependency, which is PyTest. So I can do a --dev and then PyTest, and then I will do @latest, which basically means I already have PyTest, but I want to update it to the latest version. So I had version 5.2, I'm updating 5.4, sorry, I'm updating it to 6.2. I guess that's it. So if you guys have any other questions, please feel free to let me know.
Thank you, Thnayan. That was great.
Thank you, Nayan.
Thank you. Thank you, Luis. All right.